going to go over today all of the interesting uses of sanding sticks, sanding blocks, and sanding pads that can be done. I've come up with these over the years to fit specific projects, but I find myself turning to them for a wide variety of things, and I don't see a lot of in-depth videos on YouTube about the incredible array of sanding sticks you can make, so I want to go over it briefly. So we'll start over here with sanding blocks. These are almost all half-inch MDF backed. There's some 3/4. I've used plywood at sometimes, but I really like MDF because it stays flat. I have a variety of grits all the way from 120 up to 400. And I use these on projects where I have an area that I can't afford to round something over. The side of a box, of small boxes, is probably the biggest use of these. Because if you try to use some kind of softer sanding or a random orbit sander, you are bound to round over the edges, and that's something I absolutely hate unless I'm intentionally doing it for an aesthetic. These allow you to cover wide areas if your box is quite large, or very narrow areas if your box is quite small. These can be used on the top of a box. These can be used on the face of a box. So right here we have just a little junk box testing project that I did to test out a sled for splines. This is only 2 inches, a little under 2 inches. So trying to use some kind of random orbit sander on this is going to be a total mess. You're going to round over these edges so fast. So what I like to do is I like to start out with a 150. You can either go small or you can go bigger. And you want to keep your hand very flat back and forth. This will keep this from ever being rounded over as long as you don't round your hand over. Do every side, and the small ones can also be used for an initial sanding of the top. Obviously we're going to get some sanding marks going on the wrong grain, so really this is for just leveling and narrowing off the corners on the top and the edges. Again, you will keep them flat as long as you don't round over. For some occasions when I have generally a longer box, I often like to use, my homemade T-track system, and a T-track system nonetheless, to prop the box up like this. And in order to keep it very level, you hold it like this, and you go back and forth. And you want to make sure you come from each side, so that if you're putting too much pressure down from one direction, you even that out by going the other way. You go and do this through the grits, and it's much easier on longer boxes, and maybe in general for any box, to go this way instead of going this way. Oftentimes when I make a box, like I said, it's not entirely level on the bottom. I need a way to level this out. Again, a random orbit sander, not the best option here. So what I've done is I've glued entire pieces of sandpaper, or portions of them, sometimes multiple, to 1/4 inch MDF. You could use something larger if you want, or not. But you can either hold these down with a normal clamp or a T-track clamp of some type. What I've essentially done is I've put holes through them and cut out a little space for the head, so that when I'm sanding, I don't have to worry about ever hitting a knob or anything like that. It gives me a lot more room to sand. So we've got the bottom of this box. We need it to be level. Now one of the things you can do is you can go this way or this way, but that will leave a lot of scratch marks, and sometimes if you're doing it on the top, it's a lot of cleanup work. So the more sandpaper you put down, you can go in a circle, and it will not leave a ton of deep scratch marks going the wrong way across the grain that you have to deal with later. It only leaves a little bit, and it's much easier to clean up later. I go through the grits on these as well, and you can flatten a box in, a couple minutes if it's pretty bad, even less if it's pretty good. The project I'm currently working on has some inside edges that I want to make nice gentle curves to. I don't own a spindle sander, and what I've come to realize over time is that if I don't have a rasp set, you can make essentially sandpaper rasp. These are just dowels I made. You can make them whatever size you want, very narrow, for very tight curves, or very large. I believe these are a 1/2 inch, give or take. And you essentially can work them back and forth to really fine-tune that angle. You can either go from the front or you can go from the back, whatever is easier on your back or your triceps. And this allows me to get a great view going in there and to go through the grits with this and to remove all bandsaw marks in this case. While we're on this, I like to make these kind of flatter ones. Some of them will come down into a point, some will be flat on this side, but basically I want a flat side here. And this is a perfect example of the two cases I use them. Right here in this area, I want this nice and straight and flat. I don't want to take off any of these curves. I want them to lean in and be nice and flat. Now, I can't use something too large here. So I essentially take these and you just go back and forth. And every once in a while you check it, but you will relatively quickly go through the grits and get a nice straight flat surface here. This is all still being worked on, so it's quite a bit out of shape right now. Now on this piece, I've got a very slight angle in here. So when I'm flattening this out, I can't run too far in there or else I'll start hitting into that. But I need a way to sand that nice and smooth. So that's where I come in with these very little ones. And if I want this to be round, I'll use something rounded. If I want it to be straighter, I'll use something like this. And you come in very gently and hit just the area you want. If it's very small, you make these narrower. If it's a little wider, you can go with something a little wider. I've got ones up to this size that, again, will only hit that area. This is another good case to use this size block. A lot of times when I run through the router, I don't go through this area because it can lead to some tear out. So I need to find a way to round over that little edge there to roughly match. You can use these to get a nice perfect round over by essentially riding on the round over of the router, but following it through here and just going back and forth, and you'll keep that same profile and be able to get all the way into the edges. To follow this round over, I eventually want this also to be rounded over here. I want it to be straight there, but rounded over here to match the eventual round over on all of this. And that's when I come in with a stick like this. It's got just a relatively squared off but rounded edges so that I can come in and very gently round down without taking this out of being straight and without hitting this too much. I've got very small ones for cases where I really have a tight area. And I can very quickly bring this to a round over that will match the rest of this. This is another good area to talk about these that don't have any sandpaper on the back and do not have any sandpaper hanging over the side. I eventually will want to round over this little inside part as well, but I don't want to dig into this and leave another groove I have to sand out. So I'll come in from the side like so and pull this round over here without digging into this, leaving more to clean up later. You just round over like that, and you make sure you don't have any sandpaper hanging over the edge here to avoid eating into that. I'm working on a project right now that cuts out a bunch of shapes on the scroll saw of the states that will eventually connect the Appalachian Trail. As you can imagine, getting in tight into there is nearly impossible. And some of that I won't be able to reach. But a lot of this I can reach with very specifically made sanding sticks. This is a good example of where having a very narrow edge put onto one of your sanding sticks can work really well. I can get right into these and just gently sand them little by little so that when I glue them all together they fit nicely. This is another good case where slightly rounded ones can work as well. This is obviously somewhat of a curve here, but a little much for my other sanding sticks. And I can come in like this and round that over nicely. It's another good example for one of my flat sticks, where when I want to come over and round this, but again, I don't want to put so much pressure on these that I break them. Some of them are very fragile. Come in, this keeps them level and allows me to get the nice curve that I want to match. The vast majority of my sanding sticks are made with either a group of these or just one. Almost all of these are made by just wrapping them around and duct taping. I've tried various tapes. I know duct tape is a little expensive to use on all these, but it holds well over time and allows you to really just not have to worry about it coming off. These are all made by simply spraying on glue, clamping another board over top of this, and letting them press seal. And sometimes the edges start to come off And if you want, you can fix them with a little bit of super glue. Other times the sandpaper is almost worn out by then and I just replace them. What I do suggest is that you make all of these out of a decent hardwood. These are two kind of blanks for eventual feature sanding sticks. Both of them, just toss away scraps of maple, and you really want the rigidity so that you are not accidentally rounding anything over. You want them as flat as possible. If you have a planer, it doesn't hurt to run them through the planer. If you don't, just attempt to make a decent table saw cut. Now, a lot of times I'll have a scrap like this, and if I want to make a certain profile in the edge, I will get my random orbit sander out and I will go up and down until I get the right edge profile I want for a certain corner. I do the same thing with the very narrow rounded ones. I take a normal starting out square of the stick and I take the random orbit sander and I just run it around to get the profile I want. These can take literally 30 seconds to make. They're great. You have a specific spot you need to sand and you're sitting there going, how on earth am I going to get in there? You just make something to match that exact profile. You have a box and you keep rounding over the edges with the random orbit sander, or even doing it by hand with some kind of spongy backing to your sandpaper. Just make a few of these and you'll be good to go. One last reminder is that whenever you are sanding, wear a mask. I wore this for a week last week to get an idea of how much dust would have gotten into my lungs when I'm sanding. As you can see, this is incredibly covered. Get a good mask, make the investment. I actually do not suggest wearing these. They're not a good long-term fit. You'll end up playing with them too much. And as you can see, during that week, plenty of it got on the inside as well. Klein makes a good mask, 3M makes good masks. There are a lot of masks out there. There are a lot of YouTube videos covering masks. Please wear a mask when you sand.